At 11:32 on the morning of November 29th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail section of a B-7 flying fortress named wreckage, watching German fighters swarm toward his bomber like angry hornets. 19 years old, a farm boy from Wisconsin, his first combat mission over a heavily defended target. The 8th Air Force had sent over 300 bombers to destroy Bremen's factories that morning. German defenders had already shot down 6 flying fortresses in the first hour. Moran's position was the loneliest on the aircraft. The tail gunner sat on a bicycle-style seat at the very back of the bomber, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of fuselage. His only company was a pair of 50 caliber machine guns and the German fighters trying to kill him. The B-7 carried 10 men, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer in the top turret, radio operator behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners standing at open windows, ball turret, gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a glass sphere, and Moran alone in the tail. The tail gunner's job was simple: protect the bomber's most vulnerable angle. German pilots had learned early in the war that attacking from directly behind a B-7 put them in the firing arc of only one man, the tail gunner. By November 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a catastrophic rate. The mission to Schweinfurt 2 months earlier had cost 60 flying fortresses in a single day. 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. Bomber crews called deep missions into Germany milk runs to hell. The mathematics of survival were brutal. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to go home. Statistical analysis showed the average crew lasted 15 missions. Some groups were losing half their aircraft every month. Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18. Growing up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, he had watched aircraft pass overhead and dreamed of flying. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with quick reflexes and steady nerves, farm boys who knew how to shoot. Gunnery training taught him to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in short bursts to prevent his barrels from overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of German fighters: Messerschmitt, Bf 109, Fallwolf 190. He could identify them at 2,000 yards. But training could not prepare anyone for the reality of combat over Germany. The cold at 24,000 feet dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The thin air made every movement exhausting, and the German fighters came in waves, firing 20-millimeter cannons that could tear through aluminum like paper. Wreckage had taken off from Snetten Heath in England that morning as part of the 96 Bomb Group. The target was Bremen, an industrial city on the West River. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pins, one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. The bomber formations had crossed the North Sea in tight defensive boxes, each B-7 positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was simple: pack the bombers close together so their combined firepower could drive off enemy fighters. The reality was that a direct hit on one aircraft often damaged those flying beside it. Bremen's anti-aircraft defenses opened fire as the formations approached. Black bursts of flak filled the sky. The bombers could not maneuver. They had to fly straight and level for the bomb run. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. Moran watched a B-7 in the formation ahead take a direct hit. It folded in half and dropped from the sky. Wreckage released its bombs over the target, 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories below. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight home. If you want to see how Moran's mission turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Moran. The bomber formation began its turn toward England. 200 meters of hostile airspace between them and safety. That was when Wreckage number 2 engine took a direct hit from flak. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The aircraft began losing speed. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was a death sentence. German fighter pilots watched for stragglers. A lone B-7 without the protection of mass defensive fire was easy prey. Moran saw them coming, a dozen Messids climbing from below, another group of flock wolves diving from above. Wreckage was about to fight alone against overwhelming odds. and in the tail gunner position, Eugene Moran would be their first target. The first Mises came in from the 6 o'clock low position directly behind and beneath the bomber. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and squeezed the triggers. His twin .50 calibers roared to life. Tracer rounds string fighter. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away. But there were more, many more. The wolves attacked in pairs. One would draw the gunner's attention while the other lined up a killing shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target. Spent brass casings piled up around his knees. The smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still seeped through. His breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew hot from continuous firing, while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. The German pilots were professionals, Luftwaffe veterans who had been fighting since 1939. They knew exactly how to kill a B-7, target the engines first. A bomber with damaged engines could not keep up with its formation. Then, work on the gunners. Eliminate the defensive fire. Finally, pour cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital broke. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. 20-millimeter cannon shells punching through aluminum, the sound of tearing metal. Somewhere forward, one of the waist gunners stopped firing, then the other, the intercom filled with static and fragments of voices. Moran could not tell who was speaking or what they were saying. The bomber shuddered as more rounds struck home. He kept firing. There was nothing else he could do. AF Wolf came in from the 4 o'clock position. Moran swung his guns and pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated. It spiraled downward, trailing black smoke, his first confirmed kill. He did not have time to celebrate. Cannon rounds ripped through the tail section. Moran felt something slam into his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves. The pain was immediate and intense, but his hands still worked. He could still grip the triggers. More impacts. The vertical stabilizer above him took multiple hits. Control. Cables snapped and whipped through the air. The tail section began vibrating violently. Something was very wrong with the aircraft. Moran glanced down at his parachute. Every airman wore one, the silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. If the bomber went down, the parachute was his only chance of survival. He saw holes in the fabric, multiple holes. Cannon rounds had shredded it. His parachute was useless. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to his death. The attack continued. German fighters made pass after pass. Moran counted at least 15 of them circling the crippled bomber. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was bleeding altitude and speed. The remaining engines strained to keep the aircraft airborne. Forward in the nose section, navigator Jesse Orison was still alive. He had been wounded but remained conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were both dead at the controls. The flight engineer was dead in his turret. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner, Ott, was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off from England that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orison in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered fuselage between them. Another cannon round struck the bomber. This one hit something critical. Moran felt the aircraft lurch. A grinding sound echoed through the airframe. The vibration intensified until his teeth rattled. Then came a sound he would never forget. The shriek of tearing aluminum. The scream of structural failure. Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was breaking apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section. Moran watched the front of the aircraft separate and fall away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, the bodies of his crewmates, all of it tumbling toward the German countryside 4 miles below. He was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above enemy territory, falling. The laws of physics offered no mercy. Terminal velocity. For a human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-7 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster, much faster. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds to live. The severed tail section tumbled through the sky. It spun end over end, throwing Moran against the walls of his compartment. His wounded arm screamed with pain. Blood sprayed across the interior. The wind howled through the torn fuselage where the rest of the aircraft had been. Moran should have been paralyzed with fear. He should have curled into a ball and waited for death. Instead, he did something that defied all logic. He kept fighting. The German fighters were still circling. They saw the tail section falling and moved in for a closer look. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps they were curious. Whatever their reason, they made a fatal mistake. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to die. Moran grabbed his machine guns. The spinning tail section made aiming nearly impossible. The G-forces pressed him against his seat, then threw him toward the ceiling. His arms were bleeding. His parachute was destroyed. He was falling 4 miles to certain death, and he was still shooting. Tracers arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The German pilots scattered. They had never seen anything like this. A man in a falling coffin firing back at them with everything he had. One Messermet took hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke off and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail section was shattered, but Moran could see the ground growing larger through the gaps in the torn metal. Fields, forests, roads, a patchwork of German farmland rushing up to meet him. The tail section's aerodynamics saved his life. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers acted like crude wings. They caught the air and created drag. Instead of plummeting straight down, the wreckage began to glide. The spinning slowed. The descent became almost controlled. Almost. Moran estimated he was falling at approximately 100 feet per second. Fast enough to kill him on impact, but slower than a human body in free fall. The stabilizers were buying him time. Seconds. Perhaps a minute. Time he used to keep firing at any German fighter that came close. The ground was 5,000 feet below, then 3,000, then 1,000. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate. He wrapped his wounded arms around the ammunition boxes. There was nothing else to hold on to. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at approximately 100 miles per hour. The impact snapped branches as thick as a man's arm. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding pieces of aluminum with each impact. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt his ribs crack. Both arms bent at angles they were never designed to bend. The tail section hit. Another tree spun sideways and crashed into the frozen ground. Then silence. Eugene Moran was alive, barely. He lay in the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were broken in multiple places. Compound fractures, bone protruding through skin. His ribs were shattered. Every breath brought stabbing pain. Blood poured from a wound on his head where a piece of his skull had been torn away. His brain was partially exposed to the freezing air. The crash site was in a forest near the German town of Syke, 15 miles south of Bremen, enemy territory. Moran was surrounded by people who had just watched American bombs destroy their factories and kill their neighbors. He tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were useless. The cold was already seeping into his body. Hypothermia would kill him within hours if his wounds did not kill him first. Moran crawled toward the opening where the tail section had separated from the aircraft. Each movement sent waves of agony through his broken body. He pulled himself onto the frozen ground and looked up at the gray German sky. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute. One of only 3 men in the entire war who would accomplish this feat. But survival meant nothing if he bled to death in a German forest. Voices echoed through the trees, German voices, soldiers coming to investigate the crash site. They would find an American airman with catastrophic injuries, an enemy combatant, a terrorist who had just bombed their city. What they would do with him was entirely uncertain. The German soldiers emerged from the trees with rifles raised. They surrounded the wreckage and stared at the American lying in the snow. One of them shouted orders. Another ran back toward the road, presumably to summon an officer. Moran could not resist. He could not fight. He could barely breathe. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his screams of pain as they moved his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute. They left him lying on the frozen ground while they examined the tail section. An officer arrived within the hour. He looked at Moran's wounds and shook his head. The American was clearly dying. Transporting him anywhere seemed pointless, but orders were orders. Downed airmen were to be captured and interrogated if possible. Dead airmen provided no intelligence. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blankets, no medical attention. The cart bounced along frozen roads for what felt like hours. Every jolt sent fresh agony through his broken ribs and fractured arms. The wound on his skull had stopped bleeding, but only because the cold had frozen the blood into a dark crust. The cart delivered him to a German military facility. Moran could not identify what kind. His vision blurred. Consciousness came and went in waves. He remembered being carried inside. He remembered lying on a concrete floor. He remembered German voices discussing him as if he were already a corpse. No doctor came, no medic. No one offered water or bandages or morphine. The Germans had limited medical supplies, and they were not about to waste them on an enemy airman who would probably die anyway. Moran lay on that concrete floor for 2 days. His wounds became infected. The exposed brain tissue began to swell. His broken arms turned purple and black. Gangrene was setting in. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread to his blood. Without intervention, he had perhaps 48 hours to live. The German guards watched him deteriorate. Some seemed indifferent, others appeared almost sympathetic. But none of them had the authority or the resources to save him. American bombers had been destroying German cities for months. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were overwhelmed with German casualties. And enemy airmen ranked far below German soldiers and civilians on the priority list. On the 3rd day, Moran was transported. Again, another cart. Another agonizing journey over frozen roads. This time, his destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building somewhere in occupied territory, where wounded Allied airmen were held until they recovered enough to be sent to permanent camps. The hospital was understaffed and undersupplied. German military doctors performed triage on incoming prisoners. Those with survivable wounds received treatment. Those deemed beyond saving were left to die. Moran's injuries placed him firmly in the 2nd category, but the hospital held a secret. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured on the Eastern Front. They had been pressed into service treating wounded PS, performing surgeries with inadequate equipment and almost no anesthesia. The Germans allowed this because it freed their own doctors for more important patients. The Serbian doctors examined Moran and made a decision. They would try to save him. Not because anyone ordered. Them too. Not because they had the proper tools or medications. Simply because he was a wounded man and they were physicians. The surgery lasted 7 hours. They worked with instruments designed for field operations. No proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they set his broken bones with metal pins and wire. They cleaned the infected tissue from his wounds. They removed bone fragments from his skull and covered the exposed brain with what tissue they could salvage. The Serbian doctors attached a metal plate to Moran's head, crude by modern standards, effective enough to keep him alive. They splinted his arms with wooden boards and wrapped them in bandages torn from sheets. They did everything possible with almost nothing available. When the surgery was over, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would determine whether he lived or died. His body had to fight off the remaining infection. His bones had to begin healing. His brain had to avoid swelling further. There was nothing more they could do. Eugene Moran's survival now depended entirely on his own will to live. The fever came on the 1st night. Moran's temperature climbed to 104 degrees. His body shook with violent chills, despite the sweat pouring from his skin. The Serbian doctors monitored him as closely as their limited resources allowed. They changed his bandages. They forced water between his cracked lips. They waited. Infection was the great killer in military hospitals. Antibiotics existed, but were almost impossible to obtain in a German P facility. The doctors had cleaned Moran's wounds as thoroughly as they could, but bacteria had already entered his bloodstream. His immune system was fighting a war inside his own body. The 2nd night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He called out for his mother. He screamed warnings to crewmates who were already dead. He relived the moment when Ricky Tikavi broke apart, his unconscious mind replaying the trauma over and over. The other wounded prisoners in the hospital ward listened to his ravings and wondered if he would see morning. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting with him. They had no medicine to offer, only their presence, only cold cloths pressed against his burning forehead, only whispered encouragement in accented English that he probably could not hear. On the third morning, the fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in days. He was alive. The infection had not killed him. His body had won the battle that medicine could not fight. The Serbian doctors examined his wounds and found the first signs of healing. The tissue around his skull plate was beginning to close. The broken bones in his arms were starting to knit together. Recovery would take months, perhaps years. The damage to his body was extensive, but Eugene Moran was going to survive. Word spread through the hospital. The American who fell 4 miles without a parachute. The tail gunner who kept shooting as his bomber disintegrated around him. The man who should have died a dozen times but refused to stop breathing. German guards came to look at him. Other prisoners asked to hear his story. Even the hospital administrators seemed impressed by his impossible survival. The Serbian doctors had saved his life, but they could not protect him forever. Once Moran was stable enough to travel, he would be transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp. The hospital was only a way station, a place where wounded men were patched together before being sent into the German P system. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again. His arms remained in splints. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches. His ribs ached with every breath, but he was mobile. He was conscious. He was ready for transfer. The Germans processed him with bureaucratic efficiency. Name, rank, serial number, service branch, unit assignment. They photographed him for their records. A thin young man with hollow cheeks and bandaged arms, staring into the camera with eyes that had seen too much. His first permanent camp was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a compound specifically designed to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, wooden barracks that offered little protection against the brutal Eastern European winter. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the camp. Pilots, navigators, bombarders, gunners, men who had been shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. Some had been prisoners for years. Others had arrived only weeks before Moran. All of them shared the same fate: captivity until the war ended, or they died. Moran found a strange community behind the wire. Prisoners organized themselves into units. They maintained military discipline. They created libraries from donated books. They held classes in everything from mathematics to foreign languages. They built secret radios to monitor BBC broadcasts. They planned escapes that rarely succeeded. The camp provided minimal rations, thin soup, black bread, occasionally potatoes or turnips. Red Cross packages supplemented the diet when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable. Most prisoners lost 20 or 30 pounds during their captivity. Some lost more. Moran's body continued healing. His arms regained function, though they would never be as strong as before. The headaches from his skull injury became less frequent. The nightmares about the crash never stopped. He was alive. He was surviving. But 17 months of captivity still stretched ahead of him, and the worst was yet to come. In the summer of 1944, the Germans transferred Moran to a new facility. The journey took him across occupied Poland in a cattle car packed with 60 prisoners. No room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against each other and prayed for the train to stop. The destination was another camp, then another. Over. The following months, Moran passed through 4 different P facilities as the Germans shuffled prisoners across their shrinking empire. Each transfer brought new hardships, new guards, new diseases, new ways to suffer. The worst came in the autumn of 1944, the Hell Ship. German authorities decided to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The vessel was an aging freighter, never designed to carry human cargo. Guards forced the prisoners into the hold below deck, a dark metal cavern with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no space to move. Moran descended into that hold with 200 other men. The hatch closed above them. The ship began to move, and the nightmare began. The hold was completely dark. Prisoners could not see their own hands. They could only hear groaning, coughing, retching. Men suffering from dysentery who could not reach the single bucket designated as a latrine. The stench became unbearable within hours. The crossing lasted 4 days. Prisoners died, seeing that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Men went mad from the darkness and the smell and the constant rolling of the ship. They screamed, they fought, they prayed. Some simply stopped responding and had to be checked for pulse to determine if they were still alive. When the hatch finally opened, Moran climbed out into gray daylight with eyes that had forgotten how to see. His clothes were soaked with filth. His body had shed more weight it could not afford to lose. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with pain that never fully subsided. The hell ship delivered its surviving cargo to another camp in Prussia. More barbed wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread. More waiting for a war that seemed like it might never end. But the war was ending. By January 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied armies were pushing from the west. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable forces, the prisoners. Could hear distant artillery. They could see German guards growing nervous. Something was about to change. On February 6, 1945, the change came. Soviet troops were approaching the camp. German commanders ordered an immediate evacuation. All prisoners would march west on foot. Destination unknown. Duration unknown. Refusal meant execution. The prisoners assembled in the frozen compound. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Many men had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had been surviving on starvation rations for months, and now they were expected to walk across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. The column stretched for miles, thousands of Allied airmen trudging through snow and ice. German guards marched alongside, with rifles ready. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. The message was clear: walk or die. Moran had survived a 4-mile fall from the sky. He had survived catastrophic injuries. He had survived crude surgery and raging infection. He had survived the hell ship. Now he faced 600 meters of frozen roads with a body that had never fully healed. The march would later become known as the Black March, one of the longest forced marches of Allied prisoners in European history. 86 days of walking through blizzards and freezing rain, sleeping in barns filled with animal waste, drinking from ditches contaminated with human sewage, eating whatever could be stolen or scavenged from the devastated countryside. An estimated 1,500 American and British airmen died during the Black March. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, frostbite that turned to gangrene. Bullets from guards who decided a straggler was not worth waiting for. Eugene Moran put one foot in front of the other and refused to stop. Behind him lay 17 months of captivity. Ahead lay an uncertain number of miles through enemy territory. Somewhere beyond that, if he could survive long enough, lay freedom. The Black March ground forward through February and March of 1945. Prisoners walked 15 to 20 meters each day through snow that sometimes reached their knees. They slept in frozen barns or on open ground. They ate raw potatoes stolen from fields and drank melted snow because the streams were contaminated. Moran's body protested every step. His arms had healed improperly and ached in the cold. The metal plate in his skull conducted the freezing temperatures directly into his brain. His ribs had never fully recovered from the crash. Every breath of frigid air reminded him of the injuries he had sustained 17 months earlier. Men died around him daily. Some collapsed in the snow and never got up. Others developed fevers that consumed them within hours. Guards shot prisoners who could not keep pace. The column left a trail of bodies across the German countryside, like markers on a map of suffering. But Moran kept walking. He had not survived a 4-mile fall to die on a frozen road. He had not endured the hell ship to surrender to. Exhaustion. Something inside him refused to quit. The same stubborn determination that had kept him firing his machine guns as Ricky Tikabi disintegrated around him. By April, the column had covered nearly 500 meters. The prisoners could hear Allied artillery growing louder each day. American and British forces were closing in from the west. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing. Liberation was coming. On April 26, 1945, the march ended. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The German guards threw down their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. After years of captivity, after months of marching, after countless moments when death seemed certain, they were free. Moran weighed 93 pounds. He had entered the army at 150. The crash, the surgeries, the camps, the hell ship, and the march had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, but he was alive. Medical personnel rushed to treat the liberated prisoners. Many required immediate hospitalization. Typhus had spread through the column during the march. Pneumonia was rampant. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes that would need amputation. The doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been systematically starved and brutalized for months or years. The Army processed Moran's case with growing astonishment. His service record documented the impossible. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943. Aircraft destroyed by enemy action, fell 24,000 feet in severed tail section without functional parachute. Survived impact. Captured by enemy forces, held as prisoner of war for 17 months, survived forced march of approximately 600 meters. Military historians would later confirm that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes. Eugene Moran was one of them. The other 2 had similar stories of wreckage riding, where pieces of destroyed aircraft slowed their descent enough to make survival possible. All 3 cases were considered miraculous. The Army awarded Moran 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he sustained during the attack on his bomber, 1 for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. They gave him the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force. They gave him the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. They gave him an honorable discharge on December 1st, 1945. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war, 206 aircraft destroyed, thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly in an organization defined by catastrophic losses. News of his fall had spread even during the war. Radio operators had intercepted German broadcasts describing an American who fell 4 miles and lived. The story reached Wisconsin, where Moran's family had spent months not knowing if he was alive or dead. Anonymous letters arrived describing what the radio operators had heard, hope mixed with uncertainty until official confirmation finally came. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran returned to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, in late 1945, the farm boy who had dreamed of flying while watching planes pass overhead, the tail gunner who fell from the sky and refused to die. He was 21 years old. He had aged decades. The question now was whether he could build a life after everything he had endured. Eugene Moran married Margaret Finley a few months after returning to Wisconsin. She was a local girl who had known him before the war. She saw past the physical scars and the hollow eyes and the nightmares that woke him, screaming in the darkness. She saw the man underneath the damage. They built a life together on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same landscape where Moran had grown up, watching airplanes pass overhead and dreaming of flight. Now, those dreams had been replaced by memories he could never fully escape. The roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the sound of aluminum tearing apart at 24,000 feet. Moran rarely spoke about the war, not to his wife, not to his 9 children, not to anyone who asked. The experiences were too painful, the losses too profound. 8 of his crewmates had died on Rikki-Tikki. Countless friends had perished in the camps and on the march. Talking about it meant reliving it, so he stayed silent for more than 60 years. The physical wounds never fully healed. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms remained weak and prone to pain in cold weather. His ribs ached when storms approached. His body carried the evidence of November 29, 1943 until his final breath. But Moran lived. He raised his family, he worked his farm. He attended church on Sundays and watched his grandchildren grow. He outlived most of his fellow prisoners and nearly all of his fellow crewmen. The farm boy who should have died a dozen times over instead lived to see the 21st century. In 2007, more than 6 decades after the war ended, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They chose Eugene Moran as the first recipient. Finally, officially, his state recognized what he had endured and what he had survived. The awards ceremony brought attention to his story. Journalists interviewed him. Historians documented his account. A local teacher named John Armster became fascinated by the tale and began conducting extensive interviews with Moran and his family. The silence of 60 years finally broke. Armbruster spent years researching every detail: military records, German archives, interviews with surviving witnesses. The project would eventually become a book called Tailspin, published in 2022, a complete account of the farm boy who fell 4 miles and lived. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove honored Moran by naming a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the community where he was born, where he returned after the war, and where he spent the rest of his life. The other survivor of Rikki-Tikki-Tavi also returned home. Navigator Jesse Orison had bailed out of the forward section before the bomber broke apart. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, alongside thousands of other Allied airmen. His testimony confirmed Moran's account and helped establish the historical record of that November morning over Bremen. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. He was 89 years old. 7 decades had passed since the day German flak cut his bomber in half and sent him tumbling 4 miles toward the earth. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the world spun around him. 7 decades since Serbian doctors saved his life with crude tools and impossible skill. His obituary noted that he lived by a simple philosophy: I would rather wear out than rust out. The words of a man who refused to surrender, to the Germans, to his injuries, to the march, to the silence that followed. The tail gunner position on a B-7 was the loneliest spot on the aircraft. Separated from the crew, first target for enemy fighters, last to know if the bomber was going down. Eugene Moran occupied that position on November 29, 1943, and when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not curl up and wait for death. He kept shooting all the way down. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tail gunners who fell from the sky, farm boys who refused to die, real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer, you are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Eugene Moran does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that